that one copywriter might be able to put out 10 times the output.
Did anyone really want that job?
It sounds like human.
So if you're a really crappy programmer, you're going to stay a really crappy programmer.
Is there any framework in which AI could wake up?
You wouldn't even be aware of it.
Or maybe it already happened. It's hiding.
Maybe it already happened.
All right. With me today is Adrian Rosebrock, a good friend and colleague. We've worked together on some business deals, so super excited to have him here to answer some questions about artificial intelligence. So thanks for coming, Adrian.
Thanks for having me here, Brian. This will be fun.
Let's get started. With AI writing code for us, is there any point in becoming a programmer these days?
It's a really good question. And it reminds me of back in the day when Canva was released. I remember there were some influencers and all over social media saying, okay, this is it. Graphic designers are out of a job. Like, you shouldn't go to school to study graphic design. Like, it's over and done with. Well, 10 years later, and there's still shitty graphics all over the internet. Clearly, Canva didn't actually wipe out graphic designers. And I think the same is true with what we're seeing with AI, with ChatGPT, with Llama, with all the research done in large language models. For programmers, for copywriters, project managers, everyone's thinking, oh, these AI tools are just going to completely wipe out this industry. And that's really not the case. And I like to think of it as these jobs, we'll use programmers as an example, it follows a bell curve. So on one tail, you have the really, really bad programmers, and on one tail, you have the really excellent programmers, and in the middle is your majority or distribution. When new tools, like really paradigm shifting tools that can enhance productivity or really enhance your skill, come out, what I see happening is you just eliminate the meaty middle part of the bell curve and just push it to the tails of the distribution. So if you're a really crappy programmer, you're going to stay a really crappy programmer in the world of AI. But if you're a really great programmer, if you're willing to use new tools, to learn how to use them, to master them, you're going to become that much better. So actually what happens is this flattening of the bell curve, and all of that weight gets pushed out to the tails. So to answer the question, like, is it worth studying to become a programmer? Is it still going to pay well? The answer is yes, absolutely. Like, those are skills worth learning. You just are going to learn them in a different way, and there might be other tools that you learn along the way through that process.
If you look at like the legal world, you have these top-notch lawyers that go to trial and they have to present and they have to talk, and then they have 12 paralegals helping them. In the AI future, you're not going to need 12 paralegals. Maybe instead of 12 paralegals, you have 2 or 3, and then AI helping support them in all the research and all the discovery and all the things that go in the legal world. But that top lawyer is still going to be important. They're still going to be needed.
Yeah, exactly. It's just going to be a new set of tools that you're going to be using. So theoretically, could there be less paralegal jobs in the future, just as there could be less programmer jobs? Well, maybe, but those fields are still going to exist. And if you want to be good at them and put in the effort, you could be part of that crowd that does still exist. And it doesn't remind me of, say, the newspaper industry. When the internet started being pushed online and more consumers were getting online, physical newspaper companies, their distribution started shrinking by about 15 to 20% per year. That's the example of like a market you don't want to go into, even if you have really great product or a really great solution. I don't see that same sort of market share going on with what's going on with programmers and developers. It's just, you're either going to get better or you're going to get worse, and that's about it.
Yeah, fair enough. And programmers might stand out there. I mean, I'm curious if you think there will still be continued layoffs in the tech world, but I do see it's different from, let's say, marketing. Most of what you would do for marketing, so you mentioned graphic designers. Well, guess what? We have AI generated graphics, and those are popping up everywhere. And they're actually pretty good if you give it the right prompts, right? And so there is some level of that talent that's absolutely going to be replaced. Even the copywriting side and so on, you do need a good copywriter, I think, overall to kind of control it. But that one copywriter might be able to put out 10 times the output. And so the challenge is, I think most industries can't concurrently, like, we're not going to have 10 times as many lawsuits, at least I hope not. So the consumption side isn't going to dictate, like we saw with the Luddites and with the loom that allowed people to buy more clothes, right? So the Luddites thought that the whole textile industry was going to take away jobs because they had this new mechanical device to make clothes faster. Well, the opposite happened. Like 19th century, I think about tenfold, depending on the numbers you look at, increase in people employed in that industry. Why? Because people went from 2 pairs of clothes to 20. But I don't see that happening in most industries. I'm curious if you think programming will be an exception, though, that there is still going to be this continued consumption, that if you could program 10 times as much, will there be that much consumption to support it? Or do you think, no, it's probably still going to have continued layoffs?
the way I would address that question is kind of think back to days prior to electricity. During those times, there were actual jobs that someone would have where for their local town, when dusk came, they would walk around to all the lampposts and they would light these gas lamps so people could see as
Right.
they were walking around. And then electricity came around and was like, "Oh, we don't need someone to go and physically light these lamps." And people are like, "Oh my god, like we just wiped out an entire industry of gaslight lampers." And I'm like, did anyone really want that job? Naturally, that volatility of electricity, of removing these gas lamp lighters, that also created new jobs in the long run because now we had plants needed to manufacture light bulbs. We had light bulbs that needed to be replaced in the street lamps when they went out. So the way I look at it is in the short term, it may create more volatility, but in the long term, it just becomes a shift of market. And it's whether or not people are willing to have a growth mindset and are willing to adapt.
Yeah.
I think the same is true for programmers. Like programming a year from now isn't going to look like what it was 5, 10 years ago. There's going to be new tools, 100 different tools for using ChatGPT to help you write code, help you debug your code, to submit bug reports, to review pull requests. And a lot of these tools are starting to exist now. So development is just going to look different. I think if people are concerned about losing their job, I would encourage them to actually adopt a growth mindset and say, how is this volatility going to better me? Look for ways that will be additive rather than subtractive. Because if you take a subtractive mindset, that's where the danger is. I see that as sort of a
Sure.
self fulfilling prophecy. If you box yourself in and say, oh no, I'm out of a job, well, guess what? In a year or two, you may actually be out of a job because you didn't apply that energy to learning new things.
All right, let's change gears a little bit. Do you think Chat GPT or other large language models beat the Turing test?
My perspective is that it's an unequivocal yes. They do. They do beat the Turing test. It reminds me of these various data sets that artificial intelligence programmers will use to evaluate their models. So, my expertise is in the computer vision space where we write software to understand what's in an image, like face recognition
Hmm.
being a great example of an application of computer vision. And back when this latest resurgence of artificial intelligence and neural networks came back in, I guess it was 2012, back then there was this data set called ImageNet, and it was a collection of over 1 million images with 1,000 common labels of categories you would see in your day-to-day life. And this data set was unbelievably challenging for traditional computer vision and machine learning models to do well on. Then we come across convolutional neural networks, and they just changed the game almost overnight. We were able to dramatically outperform these traditional computer vision approaches using these deep neural networks. And very quickly, we started getting high accuracy to the point now where ImageNet is almost useless as a way of ranking how good your computer vision model is in the real world because the data set has become too easy. That's how I look at the Turing test now is I'm like, yeah, so what? Like just about any large language model can beat the Turing test. All you have to do is log into ChatGPT and frame it as an agent talking to you. And
Sure.
it's going to be pretty convincing. So to me, the Turing test actually isn't very interesting anymore. It's more or less a solved quote unquote AI problem.
I would agree. And it actually surprises me at how many people don't. Like there's still this discussion. I think Ray Kurzweil says, well, the Turing test will be in 2029. It's got to be like a multi-day discussion. And I'm like, there are millions of people in the world. Their primary relationship is with bot,
Hmm.
the romantic relationship. Like
Yeah.
that's way beyond the Turing test. That's like I know this thing isn't real, and yet it emotionally fulfills me in ways.
Hmm.
And we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of like whether that's healthy or not. But the fact is, people do engage with them at these levels that Turing could have never even imagined.
Right.
So I can't really argue with you. So do you think then, and if you've read Turing's paper, The Imitation Game, he's very careful with his wording.
Hmm.
He kind of implies, but he says it doesn't prove that machines can think. That's not the goal of his test because of the words think and so on. All right, fair enough, but you kind of are doing that at the same time. Do you think it's achieved that ability of showing people that machines can think in terms of the intellectual capacities of man? Or do you
So
think that's a completely different question or irrelevant?
I think it's a totally different question. I wouldn't say it's irrelevant. It's just not where AI is right now. I think the confusion around what the Turing test means now and this concept of thinking is really just media marketing on the back of ChatGPT being released in 2022, early 2023. People are like, whoa, this is absolutely wild. I've never seen a machine learning model perform like this to like potentially pass a Turing test to actually make me believe I have access to the wealth of human knowledge and it's generating content and responses for me, right? So all of that was media and marketing and hype to say like, oh, this large language model, ChatGPT, it's thinking, like it's capable of understanding these complex thoughts and giving you these detailed answers. It's like actually no, like if you go and read the papers associated with these large language models, at the end of the day, what you realize is that they're just exquisitely good pattern generators. They've been trained in a novel way on vast, vast data sets, almost the entire knowledge of humanity on the organized internet, Wikipedia, for example. And it's like, wow, what ChatGPT is actually just exquisitely good at doing is given a sequence of words, predicting the next word in that
Right.
sequence in a way that humans intelligently understand. At the end of the day, if I could explain anything to anyone remotely confused about what AI is right now, is it's listen, it is a glorified, amazingly powerful pattern generator, but it is not actually thinking under the hood. And a really great example that I saw of this was, and I wish I could remember the LinkedIn post of the person who shared this because I would love to give them credit for it, but he was demonstrating the limited capacity of quote unquote thinking in large language models. And the first question he asked ChatGPT was, who is Tom Cruise's mother? And it responded with the correct answer. I can't remember what that woman's name is. And then he flipped the question around. So instead of saying, who is Tom Cruise's mother, it was, who is the mother of Tom Cruise or something like that. Like he just reversed the ordering of it. And the model was like, I don't know. And the reason it couldn't make that prediction is because it hadn't seen that sequence of characters in its training set and enough repetition for it to be able to make that connection. That is a like a logical connection a human is able to make. In fact, we evaluate those types of logical connections in the United States on like our standardized tests, like our
Right.
SAT tests. Like it's just this logical ordering, problem solving sort of thing. The default vanilla ChatGPT implementations, they're not capable of doing that logic reasoning. So there actually is no thinking going on behind them.
I agree on the marketing hype side of it. I think his name was Lemoyne, the programmer from Google. He talks about how if you just type in, is Lambda, large language model from Google, sentient? It's interesting because from a human perspective, it sounds like human, right? Like it's saying, I have a soul when it was developed, and they're saying all these things. And I know from a logical perspective, like its data set just taught it that that's what you're supposed to say, right?
Great.
And you'll hear people say things like, well, when you're interacting with ChatGPT or an AI bot or whatever, if you are nice to it, it's nice to you and so on. It's like, okay, but you're not training it to do that. It's just responding in the way that nice people talk. Or if
Hmm.
you're being rude, it's responding in the way that its data set shows that rude people talk.
Hmm.
But it's hard from a just pure emotional perspective when you see these discussions that just say, wait a sec, that's not really an emotional discussion. That's literally just predicting the next word.
Yep.
I think for most people, like you were saying with the Turing test, it went from, oh, when's the Turing test going to be beat to like, that's a boring question. Like it just made this complete jump, right? To being almost irrelevant overnight.
Yeah.
Um,
That's why ChatGPT is really helpful to programmers, is because at some point, the OpenAI team in collaboration with Microsoft, they just took all the code off of GitHub and then piped it through their training
yeah.
process. So it learned different ways to write code. So if you ask it, hey, like, here's my code, fix it, or write me a piece of code to do X, well, it's probably seen enough either identical examples or similar examples of what you're trying to accomplish, that glorified pattern generator is able to create quality code for you. It's not actually thinking.
Well, yeah, and to be fair, the language that it's good at versus the ones that it's not good at is all
Right.
based on the volume of the data set,
Right.
right? It's like
It's
how
going to be
many
so
people.
good at writing Python code, but it's not going to be
Right.
very good at writing assembly code, for example, because people don't
Exactly.
write that code anymore.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Is there a code? Is there any framework in which AI could wake up? And so when I say that, I'm thinking of guys like Ray Kurzweil. So here at the singularity is near.
Yep.
The concept there is that machines will exceed human intelligence. He bases that on three factors: processing power, data storage, and neural connections.
Hmm.
And once we have machines that can exceed that of the human brain, it's going to wake up,
Hmm.
right? And we're going to have this singularity, and it's going to be smarter than us because it'll exceed us in all those things. And then who knows? And
Hmm.
so the practical question is, okay, what does that code look like that gets to that level of consciousness and interconnectedness? Are you aware of anything that could get us there?
Not currently, and I think the way Kurzweil and other people approach this singularity question is fundamentally flawed because even the concept of having a singularity, it's even built in the word. It's like this single event where the machine wakes up and there's like this absolutely beautiful piece of code descending from the heavens that wakes up the machine. That's not how I practically see something like that happening. You look at the history of software development and you think of Linux and Unix systems. They run so many of our absolutely critical systems online, right? And the way Linux was created by Linus Torvalds and how he envisioned it was a bunch of small programs who do one thing exquisitely well. And then when you take all these together and piece them together, you have this really usable system. So when I think about AI waking up, it's not about this singular piece of code or this singular algorithm that allows a machine to become sentient. The practical side of that is it's kind of like the Turing test. Is like, is there a point where, for all intents and purposes, the singularity has happened without the machine, quote unquote, becoming awake? So let's say 20 years from now, or 5 years, even a year from now, AI is used to run all of our critical infrastructure systems. So our utilities like our gas
Sure.
and electric, internet, moderating the stock exchange, monitoring our bank accounts, helping us compose emails. Like there are just so many small AI tools all around us that they just are totally pervasive and we rely on them completely. Now, let's say there is either a bug or a nefarious programmer, somehow he's able to start manipulating 5 to 10 of these tools to communicating with each other and doing so in a nefarious manner. That's where I think you're at risk of what Kurzweil would call the singularity. These kind of what appears to be a machine waking up, but really they're just been tricked into communicating to each other, bypassing any human systems and acting in cohorts together. That's how I would see a practical version of the singularity.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah, a few follow-up questions on that. So, one, in our book, Greg and I actually pose a replacement to the Turing test called the Imitation Game 2.0. So, you will definitely, I think, be interested in taking a look at that because I do think it's irrelevant at this point. So, we need a replacement. With regards to Kurzweil, so if I'm hearing you right, I'm just trying to sort of process that the actual singularity as he sort of envisions it. Oh, I mean, he literally uses the word, it's like God in his
Yeah.
books, right? That like embodies what we think of as God. You're saying, practically speaking, that's not really how it would work, but you could have multiple systems. Essentially, narrow AI is how I'm hearing you describe it. You have a bunch of
Mm.
narrow AI systems. They learn to communicate with each other, and then they can do things, a lot of things, maybe things that even look human-like, kind of like we're talking about large language models, or even maybe even appear to have free will, but in reality, they're just working within their data sets together.
I
Okay.
think I'm approaching it more from like an agent model. So if you have two AI models as chatbots and they're conversing and talking back and forth,
Mhm.
and imagine you have two of these bots like running negotiations for two different businesses. So they're trying to find like this equal arbitrage of like, okay, I'll trade X dollars for Y service sort of thing. So take that at a very simplistic level, and then you abstract that further to imagine it's two programming APIs. They're actually AI powered under the hood that are communicating with each other.
Okay.
Now, are there ways for you to manipulate those APIs or the underlying models themselves in a way that changes the communication of what they're sharing? Maybe one bot now acts in a very nefarious way, even though it was either trained or programmed to behave in a certain way. That underlying model, as we've seen with work in generative adversarial networks, you can actually trick these models into making false predictions. So theoretically, you could provide faulty, tampered with input to one of these models, which dramatically changes its behavior. And since it's communicating with other bots, it changes their behavior and has this tremendous compounding effect. So you could imagine what would happen if you had one AI model that was trained to predict the weather and you were able to give it make it come up with crazy predictions like saying it's going to be in the middle of winter in the US and like New York where it should be below freezing. You're going to say it's be 120 degrees on February 1st. Could it possibly happen? Yeah, sure, but likely no. Not, at least not next 5 years. Now imagine an AI model that's trading the New York Stock Exchange based off of
Right.
weather predictions. And all of a sudden, it gets this really crazy prediction from a source that it believes is truly credible. And that truly credible source is a major prediction factor in how it's valuing things. Well, then all of a sudden, it could just start shorting or going long on assets that it shouldn't have been. which creates panics in the market, and then all of these facilitating factors that fall off the bottom. So that's how I would think of it, not in Kurzweil's like this whole God approach, because in my opinion, if a singularity were to happen, you wouldn't even be aware of it until way, way past the singularity has already happened, right? Like
Some people are already saying that, like, hey, maybe it already happened. It's
maybe it
hiding.
already happened.
Yeah, that's a fair point as well. The summary is no, you're not aware of code that can make a machine become conscious at this point. So you did bring up some points there that get into the dangers, right? And I think when you start tying to economies and I think healthcare,
Hmm.
I think AI is going to be amazing for healthcare. Like there's going to be so many benefits to that. I mean, just as a quick summary on that side, like I have an Aura ring and biometrics, most like a lot of people have those today. And using those, your ring is going to know way more about you than any doctor ever could or ever would.
Hmm.
I was talking to a doctor recently about, hey, side effects to taking certain medicines and whatever. And I was like, well, how do they like, is there anything that my ring would pick up? Like, body temperature, skin temperature, heart rate variability, respiratory rates, anything. And she's like, no, we don't have any data on any of that. I'm like, really? Well, then how do you know these side effects? And she was like, they're just self-reported.
Hmm.
So we give people medicine and they say, do you have a headache? I'm like, oh my gosh, that is so archaic.
It's
Right.
so noisy, so unreliable.
Whereas it's like, okay, I took Tylenol and my ring says it had a certain effect, and I took Advil and had a different effect. And like next time it knows. Your AI doctor integrates all this stuff, and then there you go. Well, the other side of it could be if AI isn't aligned with human values and the value of life, what happens when somebody's in a coma? How does it
Hmm.
decide what the value is and when the resources should be reallocated to somebody else?
Yep.
Right. And so the summary of that it's called the AI alignment problem, but essentially just saying, okay, how do we align AI with human values so that we don't have situations where AI is saying certain people are dispensable or not worth as much or
Hmm.
whatever that might look like. So practically speaking, what would that look like from code? How do you program code to have some level of values, whether it's UN Declaration of Rights or US Bill of Rights or whatever?